Okay, so we're going to get started, and today we have a really fun workshop. In this workshop, we are going to learn how we can build animations directly into an application. And the application we're going to be building into is going to be a React application, but what we're going to be going through does not require React whatsoever. In fact, the majority of the things that we're going to be using are pure vanilla CSS. And then after that point, I'm going to show how we can use Sass to be able to really clean up and to streamline our workflow so that we can utilize these animations from really any part of an application. So I just want to make that kind of clear from the beginning, and I'll show you what the final product is going to be here. So on this page, if I hit refresh, you see how that navigation header just kind of slowly fades in and slides down. That is the animation that we're going to be building. And you may think, oh, that's not really that big of a deal. And you're right. But the goal in this workshop is I want to show you not just how to build this animation, but to teach you the fundamentals so that you could build literally any type of application animation that you need to build in. We're going to go through the fundamentals. We're going to build the animation out. And then at the very end of the project, I'm also going to show you some very helpful tools that you can use to be able to bring animations into your application. And in the show notes for the video, I'm going to put this link in here. This is the full set of the code. And also I have here the master, which is going to be the final version of the code. And if you click here and click on starter, you'll be able to see really the beginning part of the code. And this is what I'm going to be working from. So I will place that inside of the chat if they allow me to get into the chat. There we go. Okay, so here's the link. And in GitHub, you can use either this one, either the starter, or you can simply follow along on master. Either way is perfectly fine. So I'm going to switch into Visual Studio Code. I'm going to stop the React server, and I'm going to switch into starter. And that's just going to give us the starting point that doesn't actually have any of the animation code built out. And we're going to start right at the beginning, and we're going to write these completely from scratch. So that compiled successfully. And if I now go to the application and hit refresh, you'll see it doesn't have that animation. It simply shows up whenever the page loads. So the very first thing that we're going to do is I have this main Sass file here, and I created an empty animations file, and this is just a regular Sass file. And the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create what are called keyframes. Now, I also want to provide, and I don't want you to go through this right now, but for your reference afterwards, the documentation on CSS animations is very helpful. They give all kinds of great examples, and they go into the details on how these animations work. The very first thing, whenever you're building out an animation, is it's going to start with this keyframe attribute right here. So this is going to be the very first thing that we create, and I'll include this link in the show notes, and I will also place it in the chat so that you can reference it later on. But we're going to be walking through a real world example of this throughout this entire project in this workshop. So switching back to Visual Studio Code, we're going to create this keyframe. A keyframe starts with the @ symbol, and then you can just type keyframes, just like this. And then you want to give the name of the animation. So in this case, I'm going to call it slide down, but you could call this whatever you would like. And then brackets. And inside of the curly brackets, here we define are rules. And the way, if this is fuzzy or kind of confusing, don't worry. The way that you can easily understand this is actually by thinking about how animation works in the real world. So if you think back to when Walt Disney was creating animated cartoons, like the early Mickey cartoons or anything like that, the way they created it was they drew a picture and then they drew another picture where they moved the objects just slightly. And they did that for hundreds and thousands of times. And then they started to turn the pages very quickly, and that mimicked movement. And that's really how they created animations. This works in a very similar manner. And so what we do in our keyframes here is we define what we want to have happen on a stage by stage basis. So this is a pretty basic animation we're going to be creating at first, but then I'm going to show you how we can actually add even more complexity to it later on. So we're going to say that at 0%, so this is at the very start of this, we're going to say at 0%, I want to set a certain number of things that are going to happen. In this case, I'm going to call on the transform property, and I'm going to say that I want to translate y. And this is simple math axis. If you think of it, the way an axis works in math, you have your x-axis, which is horizontal, and then you have your y-axis, which is vertical. When we say translate y, that means that we want to move something up or down. And so I'm going to say translate y minus 100%. And what that means is we're going to take whatever the element is that we're building out, and we simply want it to start. So that's this 0% right here. We want it to start 100% higher than where it's going to end up. So that is the very first thing. And then after that, I'm going to say what the next stage is going to be. This next stage is going to be 100%. Later on, I'm going to show you how we can add other stages. Like we could put in what we want to have happen when it is at 50% or 25%. We can add all kinds of rules right in there. So I'm going to say 100%, which means when this entire keyframe, when this entire animation is complete. So going back to that Walt Disney example, what we're saying is at 0%, if we're drawing Mickey, at 0%, we want Mickey just standing right there looking at us. And at 100%, we want him running off of the screen. Well, here we're saying at 0%, we want to start with the item 100% above where it's going to end up. But then when it gets to the end, so at the end of the animation, then what we want to do is to move this down so that it is at 0. So I'm going to say transform and then translate y. And then instead of 100%, you can just say the number 0. And that is all that you have to do. So this is our keyframe. Now we can't do anything with this yet. So the way animations work is you define these keyframes, and then what you can do is you can create CSS classes, and then you can call those. And that's what we're going to do next. So for the very next thing we're going to do, I'm going to create a CSS class, and I'm going to call the class slide down. Now this, I'm naming this as the same thing as the animation. You do not have to do that. You could call this ASDF and then simply call your slide down animation. It's completely up to you, but I'm going to call it slide down just because it's easier to remember. So I'm going to say slide down. And now what we do is we say that we want to call that animation. So I'm going to call animation. And right here, Visual Studio Code even gives us some helpful autocomplete where we can call the name of the animation, the duration, a timing function, a delay, an iteration count, direction, and a fill mode. We're not going to use all these. It's incredibly rare that you use all of these. So what I'm going to do is a pretty basic one. So I'm going to call the animation itself, which that is just slide down. I'm going to give a duration of 1 second. And then I'm going to add some behavior. So I'm going to say it is in and out, and then both, which this is the fill mode. So now if I hit save, And now I should have a class called slide down that I can call from anywhere in the application. So if I go to the nav bar here, and I'm going to add this as a class name. So in addition to nav, I can now type slide down. And if I hit save and come back to Chrome and hit refresh, look at that. We actually have our animation, and that really wasn't too much work. That was something that was relatively straightforward. And at the end of the day, that is your basic kind of introduction to how animations work. Now what I want to do is show you how we can extend this functionality in a few different ways. So first and foremost, imagine that we want to start reusing this type of animation throughout the entire application. So maybe we have 20 different classes and different spots that we want to add this behavior. And then to make things even more complicated, let's say that sometimes we want the duration to be 1 second. Other times we want it to be 3 seconds, and other times we want it to be a half second. And so we want to change how quickly the element slides down. Well, this would be kind of a bad way of writing code if I, say that I wanted to add this to the footer and I created a footer class, and then I'd have to remember or copy and paste this animation code, and then I would go and change this footer to be 3 seconds, and then if I wanted to do it in some other element like a cart container, and I wanted this one to be 2 seconds, I'd have to constantly copy and paste elements. I'd have to change these values, and this is really not a good way of writing code. Instead, what we can do is utilize Scss mixins. So what a Scss mixin allows you to do is to define a certain behavior or a certain set of styles, and then you're able to call that one item anywhere in the application. So let's do that here. I'm going to create it right above those set of classes. And the way you can do it is just by typing in the @ symbol and then mixin, and then the name of the mixin. And in this one, I'm actually going to call the mixin slide down as well. And now what I can do is I can take out this call here, and now I can simply call @include slide down just like this, and I'm going to end up with the identical behavior, and I can now replace each one of these calls. So anywhere in the application that I want to have this slide down behavior, I can simply call this one line of code. And imagine this is a pretty basic one. Usually when I'm building these mixins out, I might have 15, 20, 30 lines of code, and it makes it so much easier and so much cleaner to maintain when I can simply replace that with a single call to include and then the name of the mixin. So let's verify that this is working. So now if I come here and hit refresh, our animation is still working. The mixin is working. And so you can kind of see this flow where we've established our keyframes, we've defined the animation, and then from there, we've built out this mixin that we can then call from anywhere in the application, which is pretty neat. Now, let's see how else we can kind of make this a little bit more advanced and more flexible. Remember, before I wanted to change that duration, and I wanted to give other parts of the application the ability to make it last as short or as long as it needed. So what I can do with this mixin is I can add parens afterwards, and then with the $, I can pass in a list of arguments. So here I'm going to say duration, and then call that duration value. So this is, if you're familiar, if you've gotten into your JavaScript code or your Python code or whatever programming language you use, this is very similar to the way that you would pass in arguments into a function. That's all you're doing. And now what we can do is we can pass in exactly how long we want that duration to be. So for slide down, I can make it 1 second. And then for the footer, I could make this 3 seconds. And then for the cart container, I can make this a half a second, just like this. And now if I come back to the site, hit refresh, you'll see this is still working. Now let's see what this looks like if I do change it to 3 seconds and I hit save, hit refresh, and look at that. That is working beautifully. So you can see how much more scalable this is, because now any part of the application that needs to can make this call. And we don't have to remember, because if you're anything like me, remembering all of this code right here is not going to be something that is easily done. And then imagine you adding a dozen other sets of rules. And if you have to remember those each time, you're eventually going to forget something. And that's how some bugs can be introduced into the application. This is a really nice and clean way to be able to call that behavior. And as you can see, you can change it based on the needs of the application. So I'm going to switch it back to 1 second. And now let's move up and let's see some other ways that we can change this slide down type of animation. So right now we only have the start and the finish rules. Now, if we want to add in some other rules, we can do that. So what if we said at 50%, we want to change things a little bit. So at 50%, we want the transform, like right now, the way that CSS works, it assumes the 50% right now. So right now, it assumes that this should be minus 50 at that stage. And so if we go back and hit refresh, we'll see that's pretty much the way it works. And so we can change this. So say that we want to, for some reason or another, I'm not saying this is the way you should be building a slide down animation. I'm showing you this so that you can understand the way keyframes work. And so I could say, you know what, at 50% of the application, I actually only want to move it down by half. So I only want to move it down by like 75% of, which is about half of where it should be. And now if I hit save, hit refresh, do you see how it pauses right there? It gets down to about 25% of the way down. It holds for a split second, and then it continues down. You have the ability with these keyframes to control each stage of that animation, which is really cool. It gives you all kinds of control on how you want, on what you want to have happen. I'm going to get rid of that because we're not going to be using that. And I'm going to show you how we can do a few other things. So just because we have this transform rule in here, this does not mean we're limited to this one item. So a very common thing that I do when I'm building out these type of animations is I also want to change the opacity. So the opacity means the level of transparency of that element. So say that I want it to slide down, but I also want it to fade in at the same time. What I can do is add in an opacity rule that says at the very beginning, I want the opacity to be 0. And then at the end, I want it to be 1. So this is saying I want it to be completely transparent at the very start of this animation. And then I want to have it fade in so that you can see it and it's fully visible at the end of it. If I hit save and come back and hit refresh, you'll see it does that. It's very subtle. That's part of the reason why you do it. With most of these animations, it's pretty rare that you want a very jarring, intense type of animation. These are usually used for just subtle UI polishes that can really just kind of give a professional look and feel to your application. And part of the reason I wanted to show you this also was just so you can see all of the types of controls that you can add in one of these animations. So you can do transforms, you can do opacities, anything and everything you can imagine, you can have happen. You can change the color if you want to. You could really, any type of CSS style rule that you need to apply, you can have run here. And you can just think of this as a normal CSS class, except this just breaks down how the styles are applied as that element comes into view. And that's really all that we're doing when we're defining these keyframes. So hopefully all of that makes sense. And now the cool thing about this is we could add other elements here. So like we saw, we have this footer, and in fact, let's add one of these in. We could do something like, say, this is that chart container. We can copy this, hit save, and if I go to the app, inside of that horizontal tree, I can wrap that horizontal tree up in that chart container class. And let me just make that look prettier. There we go. And now if you come back to Google Chrome, hit refresh, you'll see that is coming in. I wouldn't really recommend that as something to do in your UI, but it definitely is something that you could do. And I just wanted to kind of show you how you could apply those. Now, something we could do is let's just build another one. We still have a little bit of time before the next stage. So we created this slide down animation. Let's create a fade in animation. So hopefully, if you're watching this and it's recorded, maybe you could even pause the video right now, try to do it yourself, and then see how it works. So I'm going to create one here, and this is going to be a keyframe or an animation called fade in. I'm going to remove these translate values, and here all we need is that opacity value, because that's all we're doing here. And then let's also make it a mixin. So we're going to really do the same thing here, and we can even call it by the same name. So I can say fade in. We can keep the duration. Make sure that you change the name of the animation. So fade in. And now in that chart container, instead of calling slide down, now call fade in. So we're calling that fade in mixin, and we'll keep the duration for right now for 3 seconds. Hit save, and there we go. Hit refresh. Notice that this one fades in and the nav slides down. That's pretty cool. And as you can see, that took, I think, maybe under a minute to build in that fade in functionality, and we did it the right way. We built it in a way that this fade in mixin can now be called from anywhere in the application, and you are able to use it. So now that we have all of that done, we've gone through quite a few things here. We've walked through how keyframes work. We've walked through how we can change the values based on the percentage complete that the animation is at by changing and adding in percent values here and then defining rules inside of those blocks. Then we saw how we could call that animation from a mixin with arguments to make them dynamic. And then we're able to call those mixins from the CSS classes. And finally, we saw how we were able to call those class names from within the code itself. And that could be inside of HTML, it could be a React application, a Vue application, a Rails application. It really could work with anything. And one important thing to note here that you may be curious about is when it comes to what percentage of this work is Sass versus what is vanilla CSS, then that's a great question to ask, because say that you were creating just a regular static HTML CSS website and you didn't have the ability to create a Sass preprocessor. Everything that we did here is a vanilla CSS except for these mixins. So you wouldn't have to change anything. The only difference would be instead of being able to call the mixin, you just have to call the code inside of it in each spot. So that is the only difference. Sass gives us a lot of functionality in terms of being able to reuse code, be able to nest things and styles. And so I love it. It's in pretty much every application I build out, but it's not necessary in order to create animations. This whole workshop is showing you how you can leverage that, but it's always important to understand where one library starts and another one ends and that kind of thing. So now that we have all of these built out, we built these from scratch. I want to show you a very cool tool here. And this one is one that is literally going to allow you to create and add any type of animation you can ever imagine into your applications. So this is called Anamista, and Anamista it's one of the better libraries I've found, or tools I've found, because they pretty much created and found every type of animation that you can imagine, and they put it all up in a nice little package where you can preview what the animation looks like, and then it even generates the code for you. And so let's walk through a few of these, and then it looks like, we have plenty of time. We can place some of these into our own application, which will be pretty cool. So right here, we have the scale up one. Let's see what scale down looks like. So if I click on that, you'll see it just kind of shrinks down. You can add rotations. You can do flips. The rotation one's really helpful because if you ever have seen the little spinning icons, well, unless it's some kind of GIF or something like that, that spinning icon is not going to keep on spinning, and it doesn't happen by magic. The way the spinning icon works is it's just a normal icon, and then animations were applied to it. And so the way that this one works, imagine this being kind of like a loading icon or something like that. You can add the infinite call here, and then it's just going to keep on spinning. So whenever you see a little loading icon on a website or an app, this is what's happening with that. That's all that's going on. And so this gives you the ability to really control each one of those elements. And if you remember, let's see if I'll get this auto complete again. But if you remember when I typed animation, so yeah, when I typed animation and it gave us the name, duration, timing function, delay, it gave us each one of those properties. Well, each one of those here in this application, you can actually define what those values are. Notice the names are even the exact same. So you have the name, you have the duration value, the timing function. So in addition to this tool helping you kind of streamline and just very quickly create each one of those animations, it also will hopefully help you kind of understand how to control each one of those variables. The ones we created were pretty basic. Here, you could add a lot of complexity here. Notice you can even create this use steps value where you can create multiple types of steps, which are also going to be connected to that whole percentage type of system. So that's on rotate. You could do rotate scale, all kinds of different ones. I'll show you a few of the ones that I use quite a bit. So I use slide a lot, which is part of the reason why that was the very first example I showed, because that is one that I use constantly. So slide bottom, that's pretty much, we're doing slide just like that. And if you were to get the code, it's going to look pretty much identical to what we have. Here, the nice thing is you get to also control a lot of those values. So I definitely recommend for you to go through these, and those are just the basic ones. You also have things like adding animations to shadows and those kinds of things. If you come up to the very top, you get the ability to have things like categories, so entrances, exits. One of my big ones, I definitely like attention. Just be careful when you use these. You don't want to use those too much. When you set those to infinite, you end up with some angry users. But this one
I use this one quite a bit, and you may as well, where you can actually work with animations. If you've ever gone to a website and you've seen a image that kind of slowly pans in and out or zooms and just kind of as a subtle type of animation, that is accomplished with keyframes. That is simply a set of CSS animations, and it's taking the scale values of images and then also kind of moving them on the page. And so here they have, if anybody, I'm not sure if I'm dating myself here, but if anyone's ever heard of a Ken Burns documentary, he has a kind of a very iconic way of showing different old timey like Civil War era pictures. And if you watch the documentary, the pictures move like this, like they'll have a narrator and then it has the picture and it kind of zooms in and out. Well, with keyframes and CSS, you can actually mimic that exact behavior. So now that we have this, let's actually see what this code looks like, because that can be a very helpful exercise. So to do that, just click on this little generate code icon here. We do not need the auto prefixer. Just a little note, if you've never heard of what auto prefixing is, this is something that if you're using, maybe if you're using like a static website or something like that, then that would probably be needed. That's where this little WebKit dash, and you'll see ones that are dash moz and some things like that. It's where it creates a specific set of rules for every browser type. And that was necessary a very long time ago. And it's still necessary if you're using say a static application. But if you're using a React application or anything that does, like with Webpack, where you have a auto prefixer, this isn't necessary because the auto prefixer built into the asset pipeline system should do this for you automatically. So I'm not going to need that. And so here you can copy the class, and let's open up our code. We'll move all the way down just so we can see that. So this one's called Ken Burns Left. You have animation, you have the name, you have the duration, you have each of those values. And now we can copy the keyframes, and let's see what that looks like. So here starts off with just a comment. And then here with the keyframes, this is what's happening. So we have a transform where it's changing the scale and it's also translating the value. This is very similar to translate X and Y. They're simply calling it as a function, and then they're transforming the origin, and they're simply setting some values. So as you can see, even though that's a pretty advanced type of look and feel, like if you go to a website and you see the images just kind of slowly moving like that, you may think that that would take a ton of code to get working. But as you can see right here, it takes less than 10 lines of code in order to implement all that behavior. And then you can call that from anywhere in the application. And the way it's accomplished is by using this transform rule with scale, translate, and then transforming the origin. And that's really it. And then you're able to call each of these values. So that's why at the very beginning of this workshop, I said what I wanted to teach you was how to build these animations out. But the example that I was going to teach you was not just, I just didn't have the goal of teaching you how to make a nav bar slide down. I wanted to teach you how you could build literally any animation. And so hopefully now what you can see, because this Ken Burns type of moving image element, this looks very different than what we did with the nav bar. But as you can see, the actual code doesn't look that different. And if you can understand how to build one animation, then you're on your way to being able to understand how to build any of them. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that is now something, because my goal with these workshops is to really kind of pick one specific topic, dive deep into it, and for you to have something, not just that you learned, but also something really practical that you can take and you can copy and paste this code, you can use it directly in your own applications. And now you have the ability to do that. Now, any application that you build, you can add these type of animations. And so hopefully that's going to be something that helps you along your development journey, because I have noticed through the years that students sometimes can feel a little gun shy or a little intimidated when they are told to go build out some type of animation, because if they've never done it before, that can be something that can definitely be a little bit intimidating. But as you can see right here, it doesn't take that much code at all. It's just a matter of understanding the way that these keyframe rules work. Usually with animations, you're going to be using this transform rule, and then you working with scale, translate, and these type of things. Well, really one of the best ways that I found, it definitely helped me out a lot when I was doing this myself, is by going through tools like Anamista. And there are hundreds of these types of websites like this that auto generate these type animations. This one's just my favorite. And by going through this, you can kind of almost reverse engineer how these animations work. And so hopefully if you do that enough in enough of your projects, then even if this is still a little bit fuzzy and a little bit confusing today, a few months and definitely a few years down the road, anytime you're asked to build some type of animation into an app, into some website, you're going to immediately know what to do. It's not going to scare you at all. You're going to be able to take whatever you're asked to build and you'll go and apply it.